So how is the market based on the Russian-Ukraine war ultimatum? Ukrainian sovereignty won't be the only casualty of Russian President Vladimir Putin's efforts to assert the actual Russian influence and interest in Crimea. It is still far too early to calibrate how this crisis will play out and what its consequences will be. But it's a fair bet that whether it ends in a Putin victory, defeat, or draw, that it is going to make a difficult situation in the Middle East even more complicated as of today. Bear in mind, whether Putin wins or loses in Ukraine, the odds that Russia could be a reliable partner for the US have decreased dramatically, and this only reinforces the painfully obvious. When it comes to the core issues facing the US in the Middle East, the US must focus on outcomes, not solutions, and be very sober about what it might do to contribute to them. As this goes, Putin's fortunes, so go those of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. However, the crisis turns out with one possible exception. The Syrian regime is likely to benefit, and that exception is the highly unlikely contingency that Putin is so weakened from a botched policy in Ukraine or an uncharacteristically bold response from the United States and the West that he is permanently damaged and diminished or removed from power. Not likely. The possibility that events in Ukraine will leave Putin victorious will only buck up al-Assad further and demonstrate that the Russian street credibility is rising. After all, in September, Putin masterfully intervened and used diplomacy to stay a US military response against al-Assad's use of chemical weapons against civilians. Now we have a whole different situation. Putin appears to be standing up to the international community and ready to use force to protect Russia's interest in the Ukraine. He is clearly not prepared to do that for Syria, but victories for Russia, particularly in the face of the West's empty rhetoric and red lines, can only reinforce al-Assad's conviction that he is betting on the right ally. In terms of the Ukraine, mobilizing troops amid crisis with Russia. Let's examine this. A Putin win maintaining significant Russian influence in Ukraine that clearly undermines the Ukraine's sovereignty will leave Russia stronger and more dependable as a partner and allies in the eyes of al-Assad, and probably Iran. Although Iran is not nearly as dependent on Moscow as al-Assad is, its supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei looks at the crisis and sees Russian resolve in the face of a feeble West. The hardliners in Tehran will draw their own conclusions about their margins for maneuvers in maintaining the nuclear weapons aspirations, as it has been all over the news. Russia has never been as allergic as America to the possibility that Iran will become a nuclear threshold weapons state. Iran will cut its own deal with the US on the nuclear issue if it gets the right terms, regardless of what Putin thinks. But given the long odds against a comprehensive accord, should diplomacy fail, Tehran will likely be able to count on Russia to block punitive action in the UN Security Council and discourage the use of US military force. A Putin defeat, on the other hand, in the Ukraine won't help matters in the Middle East much either, unless the crisis somehow delivers a knockout blow to Putin. A chastened Putin would probably be even more ordinary and recalcitrant about cooperating with the international community on Middle Eastern issues. But either way, the Russians are determined to frustrate US solutions to Middle Eastern problems that seem like a Pax Americana and exclude Moscow. We have to bear in mind that the reactions to the West's efforts to meddle in what Putin believes is Russia's sphere of influence and to oppose Moscow will create a mini Cold War that could, for the remainder of the Obama administration and probably beyond, freeze productive U.S.-Russian cooperation across the board. Let's understand this a bit beyond this point. Should Russia manage to have its way in Ukraine, smaller powers will take notice, particularly those nations whose interests can be at odds with the West and the United States. Russia, it is not a small power, but it is standing up to America and the West. And for the true smaller powers, how big reacts when faced with a challenge from small can be very instructive. And the Syrians, Iranians, and North Koreans will pay close attention to the West's resolve. It can be a good thing if Russia acts in the Ukraine without cost and consequence. Israel isn't a friend of Russia, nor an adversary of the US, but the Israelis have been already seeing what US words mean when it comes to their own determination to continue settlement policy, and to the US threats to use military force in Syria or even against Iran. They have concluded that the words mean very little. The Saudis have reached, however, many of the same conclusions about the Obama's administration willingness to say what it means. And this is more important to act upon what it is said. The America's image over the years has been a big change since it has gotten into trouble when the issue of protecting its credibility is the be-all and end-all in defiance of common sense and wise policy. Credibility comes from believing when a president speaks of policy, he will make good on his words if need be. If there is no cost or consequence for saying no to the United States, then Washington will have zero street credibility. At the same time, if the U.S. tries to maintain credibility by doing dumb or stupid things or by overreacting, it undermines what it's attempting to protect. The Obama administration's street credibility is very low. Everyone says no to the U.S. seemingly without consequence. Al-Assad, Putin, Afghanistan's President Hamid Karzai, and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, Iraq's President Nouri al-Maliki. It seems the U.S. even gets yes buts from friends and allies like Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu and the Palestinian Authority President today, Mahmoud Abbas. Partly, this comes from the U.S. setting expectations a little bit too high, misreading the way the world actually is. This underestimates how determined smaller powers can be, and it comes from the reality that the U.S. doesn't control the world now and never did. Now, we have a very risk-averse president who's focused more on domestic affairs than foreign policy. And he is a leader more committed to improving the middle class as his legacy than he is to the Middle East and its insoluble troubles. Today's president is facing a crisis in the Ukraine where geography, history, and proximity favors Putin and leave Washington with a weaker hand. Perhaps some face-saving win can be devised, but if not, and perhaps unfairly, because Obama's options are bad ones, America will be again judged a weak and fickless power. As for the Middle East, regardless of how Ukraine goes, the president's fortunes will remain more or less the same. The United States will remain shackled with a Putin who is no friend and stuck in a region that it can be neither repair nor leave.